6.6 graphs of secant and cosecant functions. So with these, the easiest way to do these is to first graph sine and cosine. So I'll start with, well, in the order that they're in the title, we'll start with secant. So I am going to set up the graph of cosine first so that we can see what's happening here. So we're still going to go out to 2 pi, like normal, and in both directions. And then on these ones, I do need the amplitude, so I have -1 and 1 on the y. For tangent and cotangent, we didn't need anything on the y. So secant goes with cosine, so I'm going to first graph cosine, and then I'll graph secant based on cosine. So where does cosine start?
1.
At 1. So we start up here, we go down, and then back. Okay, so now for secant, I'm going to have asymptotes here, okay, because secant is 1 over cosine. So anywhere that cosine is 0, so anywhere that there's a point on the x-axis, I am going to put a vertical asymptote. So I'll do that in, let's do purple. So at -3 pi over 2, pi over 2, or well, -pi over 2, pi over 2, and at 3 pi over 2. I'm going to have
Everywhere there's a what?
a 0, so anywhere there's a point on the x-axis. Try to adjust this here, I can see. So any of these points, because that means that cosine is 0. And so if we did 1 over cosine, which would be equivalent to secant, that's undefined. So now, this graph, so I'll do it in blue to match secant there, is a U, okay, with the bottom of the U on these points, okay? So this is going to be, so like this first one is a U. It goes like this. It doesn't cross the vertical asymptotes. It just goes up like that. These ones are just upside down U's down here. So they kind of look like parabolas. And then this one over here will just keep going. So I'll just do that, because that graph would just keep going. So when I ask you to graph the parent functions on the test, if you want, you can just do like graph cosine, and then on that same graph, instead of having to do it a second time, you can just go ahead and graph secant. Just make sure you label which one's which. Because that way it doesn't take up so much space.
What would you be figuring out with this? Is it like defined?
Well, with the graphs of secant and cosecant and even tangent, there's not, I mean, there are like word problem things that you can do with them. But the only ones that you would really, I guess, have a benefit to using this for is sine and cosine. And if you take pre-cal, we do have to do a few like graphing word problems, but they're not as bad as like that sounds. Like that sounds awful, but when you actually do them, like it's, you know, it's like 1 or 2 questions on the AP exam probably. So I told them not something to be overly worried about, but we did look at it. So, all right, so that took care of secant. So now we need to look at cosecant, and cosecant goes with what function?
Why? X, I mean.
What other trig function does it go with? Like secant went with cosine.
It's an S, secant? No, wait.
Sine.
Sine, that's what it is.
Yep, so I'm going to draw the sine function first. And again, we need the amplitude values on here. So this one's going to work the exact same way as secant, except for we'll be looking for the values of sine that are 0. So where does sine start?
0.
At 0. And we go up. So just like when I said where is cosine 0, because 1 over cosine of 0, or like 1 over 0 is undefined, we had vertical asymptotes for secant. I'm going to do the same thing here for cosecant, because cosecant is 1 over sine. So anywhere that sine is 0, I'm going to have a vertical asymptote as well. So in this case, on this parent function graph, I actually have 5 of them, because I have 5 points at 0. So at negative 2 pi, at pi, I also have one at 0, so I would just maybe extend the dots a little bit past the axis there, just so it can be seen. Then at pi, and at 2 pi. And then the shape is exactly the same as secant. So we find the dots here that are at 1 or negative 1, and we're drawing U's again. So it will look like this. And so that will be your parent function for cosecant. So that one can also be drawn once you do your sine graph. You can just go ahead and do that one on the same thing for the test. Any questions about these? It's pretty easy. That's all you need for this section. No homework.